The Untold Story. Why America once labeled Mandela a terrorist. In the annals of human history, few stories capture the profound transformation of perception quite like that of Nelson Mandela, a man whose journey from condemned prisoner to international icon of peace represents one of the most remarkable reversals of fortune and reputation ever witnessed on the global stage. This extraordinary narrative begins not with accolades and international recognition, but rather in the darkest corners of political imprisonment, where a man branded as a terrorist and communist agitator would spend 27 years of his life behind bars, only to emerge as one of the most celebrated advocates for human rights and racial equality the world has ever known. The story we are about to explore challenges our fundamental understanding of how history judges individuals, how political narratives evolve over time, and most importantly, how the unwavering commitment to justice and equality can ultimately transcend even the most systematic attempts at character assassination and political suppression. Mandela's transformation from public enemy to global hero serves as a powerful reminder that truth, justice, and human dignity possess an inherent strength that can overcome even the most entrenched systems of oppression and propaganda. To truly comprehend the magnitude of Mandela's eventual international acclaim, we must first understand the depths from which he emerged. The systematic campaign that sought to brand him as a dangerous radical, and the extraordinary circumstances that led to his imprisonment for what many considered to be a lifetime sentence. The apartheid regime of South Africa, in its desperate attempt to maintain when Nelson Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment, the charges against him were carefully constructed to paint him not merely as a political dissenter, but as a dangerous terrorist whose very existence threatened the stability and security of the South African state. The prosecution's case rested heavily on allegations that Mandela and his co-defendants had engaged in acts of sabotage conspiracy to overthrow the government through violent means and collaboration with communist forces that sought to destabilize the existing political order. These charges were not merely legal technicalities, but rather represented a comprehensive strategy to ensure that Mandela would be viewed not as a freedom fighter or civil rights advocate, but as a criminal whose actions endangered innocent lives and threatened the fundamental fabric of South African society. The apartheid government's propaganda machine worked tirelessly to reinforce this narrative, presenting Mandela as a communist sympathizer who had abandoned peaceful protest in favor of violent revolution, a characterization that resonated particularly strongly during the height of the Cold War, when communist ideology was viewed with deep suspicion and fear by Western nations. But to ensure that any international support for his cause would be undermined by the perception that he represented dangerous radical elements rather than legitimate political opposition. The charges that led to Mandela's life sentence were rooted in his involvement with Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing of the African National Congress, which he had helped to establish in response to the increasingly violent suppression of peaceful anti-apartheid demonstrations by the South African security forces. The prosecution argued that this transition from peaceful protest to armed resistance represented a fundamental shift toward terrorism, a characterization that would haunt Mandela's reputation for decades and provide ammunition for those who sought to discredit his eventual emergence as a global symbol of peace and reconciliation. The evidence presented during the trial painted a picture of a man who had allegedly conspired to commit acts of sabotage against government installations, railway lines, and other infrastructure deemed vital to the functioning of the apartheid state. More damaging still were allegations that Mandela had sought financial and military support from communist nations, particularly the Soviet Union and its allies, a charge that carried particular weight during an era when the global political landscape was defined by the ideological struggle between capitalist democracies and communist regimes. Throughout the lengthy legal proceedings that would ultimately determine his fate, Mandela maintained his dignity and continued to articulate his vision of a democratic, non-racial South Africa, even as the prosecution sought to portray him as a dangerous revolutionary whose ultimate goal was the violent overthrow of the existing government. The trial itself became a powerful platform for Mandela to explain his political philosophy and to challenge the fundamental premises of the apartheid system, but these eloquent defenses were largely overshadowed by the sensational nature of the terrorism charges and the government's successful efforts to control the narrative surrounding his case. The international community's initial response to Mandela's imprisonment reflected the effectiveness of the apartheid government's propaganda campaign, as many Western nations, while critical of South Africa's racial policies, were reluctant to embrace a figure who had been labeled as a terrorist and communist sympathizer. This reluctance was particularly pronounced among conservative political leaders who viewed the Cold War struggle as the defining challenge of their era, and were therefore suspicious of any individual who appeared to have aligned himself with communist ideology or accepted support from Soviet-backed organizations. However, as the years passed and the true nature of the apartheid system became increasingly clear to the international community, perceptions of Mandela began to shift dramatically, driven in large part by a growing global awareness of the systematic injustices that had prompted his turn toward armed resistance in the first place. International human rights organizations, anti-apartheid activists, and progressive political leaders gradually began to reframe Mandela's story, presenting him not as a terrorist, but as a prisoner of conscience, whose only crime had been his unwillingness to accept the dehumanizing effects of institutionalized racism. This gradual transformation in international opinion was accelerated by a sustained campaign of advocacy and awareness raising that brought global attention to the conditions of Mandela's imprisonment and the broader injustices of the apartheid system. Musicians, artists, politicians, and activists from around the world joined forces to demand Mandela's release, organizing concerts, protests, and diplomatic initiatives that gradually shifted international opinion and increased pressure on the South African government to reconsider its position. The campaign for Mandela's freedom became a global movement that transcended traditional political boundaries, uniting individuals and organizations from across the ideological spectrum in recognition that his continued imprisonment represented a fundamental affront to human dignity and justice. Celebrity endorsements, cultural boycotts, and economic sanctions combined to create an international environment in which South Africa found itself increasingly isolated, and pressure to release its most famous political prisoner continued to mount. By the late 1980s, the combination of international pressure, internal resistance, and changing global political dynamics had created conditions that made Mandela's continued imprisonment politically untenable for the apartheid government. The end of the Cold War had eliminated much of the ideological justification for viewing Mandela through the lens of communist conspiracy, while the growing international consensus against apartheid had made his status as a political prisoner a source of diplomatic embarrassment for the South African regime. When Mandela finally walked free from Victor Verster prison on February 11, 1990, after 27 years of imprisonment, the world witnessed one of the most extraordinary moments of political transformation in modern history. The man who had been condemned as a terrorist and communist agitator emerged as a figure of dignity, wisdom, and reconciliation, whose very presence seemed to embody the possibility of peaceful transition from oppression to democracy. The years following Mandela's release saw an unprecedented transformation in his international reputation, as the former prisoner became the focal point of global efforts to support South Africa's transition to democratic rule. The same international community that had once been reluctant to embrace him now competed to honor his contributions to human rights and social justice, recognizing that his commitment to peaceful reconciliation, despite decades of imprisonment, represented one of the most powerful examples of moral leadership in contemporary history. The culmination of this remarkable transformation came in 1993, when Mandela was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize jointly with Frederick de Klerk. the white South African president who had authorized his release and initiated the negotiations that would lead to the end of apartheid. This prestigious recognition represented the complete reversal of Mandela's international reputation, transforming him from condemned terrorist to celebrated peacemaker in the eyes of the global community. The Nobel Peace Prize was merely the beginning of an unprecedented wave of international recognition that would see Mandela receive more than 250 awards and honors from nations, organizations, and institutions around the world. Among these prestigious recognitions was the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States, which acknowledged his extraordinary contributions to the advancement of human dignity and democratic values. Perhaps most symbolically significant was his receipt of the Order of Lenin from the Soviet Union, an honor that served to rehabilitate his earlier associations with communist ideology by reframing them within the context of his broader struggle for human rights and social justice. These honors and recognitions represented more than mere diplomatic courtesy or political correctness. They reflected a genuine recognition of Mandela's unique contribution to human progress and his demonstration that even the most entrenched systems of oppression could be overcome through moral courage, strategic thinking, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The transformation of his reputation from that of a dangerous radical to that of a moral exemplar provided powerful evidence of the capacity for human beings to transcend the limitations imposed by political circumstances and historical context. The story of Nelson Mandela's journey from condemned prisoner to international icon serves as a powerful reminder of the complex relationship between historical context, political narrative, and moral truth. His experience demonstrates how individuals who challenge unjust systems are often subjected to systematic campaigns of delegitimization and character assassination, but also shows how sustained commitment to principle and justice can ultimately triumph over even the most sophisticated efforts at political suppression. As we reflect on Mandela's extraordinary transformation from prisoner to peace laureate, we are compelled to examine our own assumptions about political leadership, moral courage, and the nature of historical change. His story challenges us to look beyond the immediate characterizations and labels that are often applied to those who challenge existing power structures, and to consider the deeper principles and values that motivate their actions. The international recognition that Mandela ultimately received was not simply a correction of historical injustice, but rather an acknowledgement of the universal values that his struggle represented. His commitment to human dignity, racial equality, and democratic governance transcended the specific context of South African apartheid to become a source of inspiration for oppressed peoples around the world, and a powerful reminder of the potential for peaceful transformation even in the most challenging circumstances. In our contemporary world, where political polarization and ideological division continue to shape public discourse and international relations, Mandela's example provides a crucial reminder of the importance of looking beyond immediate characterizations and political labels to understand the deeper principles and values that motivate individuals to challenge unjust systems. His transformation from condemned terrorist to celebrated peacemaker serves as a powerful testament to the capacity for human redemption and the ultimate triumph of justice over oppression. The lessons of Mandela's extraordinary journey remain as relevant today as they were during the height of the anti-apartheid struggle, reminding us that history's judgment often differs dramatically from contemporary political assessments, and that those who are vilified in their own time may ultimately be recognized as champions of universal human values. His story encourages us to examine our own preconceptions, to challenge unjust systems wherever we encounter them, and to maintain faith in the ultimate triumph of truth and justice, even when faced with seemingly insurmountable obstacles. As we consider the legacy of Nelson Mandela's transformation from prisoner to peace laureate, we must recognize that his story is not merely an historical curiosity, but rather a continuing call to action for all those who believe in the fundamental dignity and equality of all human beings. His example challenges us to examine our own communities, our own societies, and our own world with the same critical eye that he brought to the apartheid system, and to commit ourselves to the ongoing struggle for justice, equality, and human rights wherever they are threatened or denied. The time has come for each of us to ask ourselves what role we will play in continuing the work that Mandela began, what systems of oppression we will challenge, and what legacy we will leave for future generations. His transformation from condemned prisoner to international icon was not merely the product of historical circumstances, but rather the result of countless individuals around the world who chose to look beyond political labels and propaganda to recognize the fundamental justice of his cause and to work tirelessly for his freedom and the principles he represented. Today, we must ask ourselves, what causes will we champion? What injustices will we confront? And how will we contribute to the ongoing struggle for a more just and equitable world that honors the dignity and rights of all people, regardless of race, nationality, or political affiliation?